Welcome, everybody. If you aren't sure what webinar you've stumbled into, this is the webinar around getting diversity and inclusion right while working from home. And we are going to be thinking about how to approach and maintain momentum for this movement through a suddenly remote lens. Next slide. Maybe. All right. So I'm Jen. I am one of the founders of Range. We are a team collaboration software, helping teams work better together, feel more connected at work. My background is varied, but has a mix of working in consulting and finance, as well as diversity and inclusion, particularly in tech. And given my background in that, I am a little bit having a fangirl moment to have both Ellen and Nicole here, whose work I've followed for a while. I will ask them both to introduce themselves. Let's start with Ellen.
Hi, I am Ellen Powell. I am the CEO and co-founder of Project Include. We are a nonprofit that works on giving everyone a fair chance to succeed in tech. And that means working with data to help set benchmarks and to really help advocate and evangelize the different things that need to happen in the tech industry for fairness. And we also work closely with CEOs to help them advance their D&I learnings and efforts within their startups. I am also an angel investor. I'm trying to think of the right adjective because I'm not super active, but I am an angel investor in Range, and I really enjoyed watching them develop their product over time, and working with folks like Jennifer has been awesome.
Thank you. Nicole.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nicole Sanchez, and I'm the managing partner and founder of Via Consulting. And I just began my 27th year doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Doing diversity, equity, and inclusion professionally. Most of that time has been in tech. And my firm right now works with companies trying to advance everything from their representation to the equity of their systems, to the inclusion of their culture. And we like to get in and get our hands dirty with lots of interesting and complex things that our clients present. But we're very much about the how. How do you get this done? What are the actual skills and implementations that you need to put in place in order to move the needle on DEI? So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you all. One last question before we get into kind of the topic at hand, which is, are you wearing hard or soft pants today for our webinar? I'll go first. I would say I'm at a medium level in between. I recently purchased some new quasi hard pants. So I tried to dress up for this webinar today. What about you all?
I am wearing shorts. This is my first time this, and I will never do it again because you have outed me. Like, I was like, I can wear shorts. No, apparently you can't.
I put on jeans because jeans make you feel awake. I was like, nah, I'm not staying in my yoga pants or pajama pants per usual. I really, I thought about my respect for Range and for Ellen and you. And
the jeans really constrict the blood flow, make it all like awesome. Michael, can you go to the next slide? So when we first started planning this webinar, it was as COVID had kind of really taken hold in the United States, and it was becoming clear that a lot of companies were going to be working from home for a while. And so what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of the state of D&I in the workplace, the future of diversity and inclusion, and then building on some of today's momentum. So next slide. So what's happened kind of between COVID starting and us kind of thinking about this webinar and today is that there has been a huge uptick in the racial justice movement. And we are very excited about that here at Range. But one of the things that I think makes that really important when we talk about diversity and inclusion in tech is this quote reflects is that it's not just a tech problem. We are one aspect within a broader system. And so one of the reasons I'm so excited to have both Nicole and Ellen here today is that we can talk about both the kind of work internally at companies, but also the role that companies have and individuals have in the broader racial justice movement and what we can do to be a part of that. So wanted to share that, and Ellen and Nicole, feel free to share thoughts on that topic as well before we kind of dive into anything else. Cool.
No, go ahead.
Next, go ahead. All right, next slide, Michael. Cool. So we wanted to start off with talking a little bit about the state of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. I'm guessing that our attendees, by having opted in to join this webinar, have some kind of knowledge about the state of the industry, but as someone who's worked in diversity and inclusion specifically, but also taken step backs to focus on kind of starting a company in kind of a slightly different space, it's easy to get out of the loop, which is a good thing because the movement is really progressing. So I'd love to kind of hear reflections on what you think of as the current state of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, maybe starting here with Nicole and then sharing with Ellen.
Sure. So the current state is that there's a renewed interest in this topic. And, every few years we go through sort of one of these, like, it's not exactly a hockey stick, but it's sort of like an inflection point. And there's a renewed or resurged interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And I will say, one of the things that's different this time, thanks in large part to the movement for Black Lives, is that I don't have to explain as much of what I do anymore. I think people feel the pain of what it means to get it wrong inside their organizations, and they are either surprised or pleasantly relieved to find out that there are people who work on this full time, people like Ellen, people like me, lots of folks from other organizations and consulting firms. And the questions that they're asking, I'm seeing to be more sophisticated now. As opposed to just tell me why diversity is important. I think it's important. That seems nice to, oh, we're getting it wrong. And our employees of color, and specifically our Black employees, we're hearing them differently. And the thing that I'm finding inside companies is not so much that the message is different or new, or that there haven't been people saying this for a really long time, but because of this political moment, it's landing on predominantly white leadership differently.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I have to tell them is the argument isn't new, the subject isn't new, you're hearing it in a new way. And so that's one of the things that I would say has definitely shifted in this current state.
Yeah. Do you see similar things, Ellen?
Yeah, definitely. I'd also add that I think white employees are hearing it differently too, not just the management, but the employees, and they're speaking up. And now when you see like a lot of the old tactics, like I'm going to donate some money, or my company is going to make a statement about, this issue.
Yeah.
Employees are saying, hey, we're not happy. Like, you need to look internally. You can't just make these PR statements and walk away. We're going to hold you accountable. And that's very different than I've seen in the past. I also think I think it's, first, it's a different generation. I think the new employees coming out of schools, like the people who are in school right now, like very, very inclusion oriented. Even the people who aren't from underrepresented groups want to see underrepresented groups working at the companies that they go to. And this is something that companies are now forced to think about. Like, I can't just hire white men because I can't even get the white men to join. And, and if I look ahead, it's going to be 50% not white men in the workforce. And if I can't even get the white men to join, then what is my pool going to look like? And that's driving a lot of change. So I think it's hard to unsee a lot that we're seeing now. Like, people are starting to realize, like, this is systemic, and you can see it in everything that happens. And that's a very different perspective than being able to rationalize away and kind of, make some public statement and then wait for things to die down. This is not dying down. We're in protest for 2 months now, right? Like, this is something that people are now aware of, and they really want to see change. And that's in the workplace too.
I'm curious to actually kind of address lightly, that's a question that someone wrote in here. How do you see the role of non-Black people in advocating for this work internally at companies, or in a webinar like this, and kind of sharing what we've learned? And how do you think about kind of the role that you have versus the role of holding space for Black people to advocate for themselves? Like, how do you think about that?
You want me to go?
Sure.
Yeah, it's hard because I do, like, in the other panels I do, I always try to have representation. So I have turned down many panels, or I've required panels to include a Black person. I think at this point in time, like Nicole was saying, people haven't, Black people have been doing this work for years and years and years, and it's time for other people to step up. and take on that role. Obviously, we're not going to be able to share the Black perspective in the same way, but if we can share these messages in a way that is educational, hopefully we get people down that path. Recently, I gave a talk with Michelle Kim on, on Asians for Black Lives Matter and how Asians have a role. So I think we have a role, and it's not to replace Black speakers and advocates, but to kind of push the movement forward without having to drain more of the energy of the people who have been doing this and are still doing this in other areas as well.
I think that was
Nicole,
great.
do you have anything?
That was
Yeah,
great.
cool.
Yeah, I want to make sure we
I
get
thought so as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that resonates very much with how we were thinking about it as well. Michael, do you want to go to the next slide? So the area that we wanted to start with is actually on diversity. I think a lot of the discussion will probably lean more on the inclusion side, given that it's about how we kind of include people while working from home. But a couple kind of topics that came up in this space. One area is that we've heard for a long time that if you could hire people from all over the US, it would be this like kind of silver bullet for diversity. That like if you can hire people elsewhere, then suddenly that allows you to have a much more diverse workforce because it's not tied to one area. I'm curious if you all are seeing that actually happen, or how you are seeing kind of everyone being at home change how people think about hiring from a diverse perspective. Maybe starting with Nicole on this one.
So we have, and I believe this, that for a long time, being able to hire folks who are distributed and have a distributed workforce is better for diversity. My whole firm is distributed by design. We've never been co-located, and I've got people on a couple different continents and several different countries as well. And I think there's an upside and a downside, just like everything. Number one, if you are a company that is very good at having a distributed workforce, period, like this is something that's been built into your DNA, then it can be great. But there are a lot of systems that don't automatically translate to a remote workforce, specifically around things like documentation and communication and participation in decision making, especially when you've got time zones to consider. So it is not a magic anything for a company that doesn't know how to do remote work well, period, for anybody. And so one of the things I think we're seeing right now is how different working from home is for people when it's thrust upon them versus when they can opt into it. And that's the big difference. We're not really doing work from home as an opt-in right now. We're doing work from home as a everybody has to. And some of our lives are just not set up for that. Some people truly need to get out of their home and into a shared workspace in order to get work done because of, the strain on them at home, the space, whatever it is. And some of us really thrive working at home because we've got some quiet space and that sort of thing. So as we figure out how to reassemble a workforce, we have to remember that nothing is automatically better. The other thing that's going to happen is that as we hire people from parts of, at least just in the United States, from parts of the country where cost of living is lower, and that increases our racial and ethnic diversity, we have to remember to not reproduce redlining in our own companies, which means, sure, if you're Black and you're from the South and you wanted to stay where you were from in Mississippi, we're going to pay you a lot less than the person who wanted to move to San Francisco and does the same job, right? And so there are a lot of balances. There are a lot of things that we have to balance in the name of equity and inclusion if we think that diversifying via a remote workforce is going to be one of our strategies. But I will say it's not simple. And it is not something that you can automatically think that your company will just be good at without putting the resources in for any person.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see I work in people ops for Range, and been interesting to see kind of the dialogue across companies around this equal pay for equal work idea. Like how do you as a company have a financially reasonable balance sheet and pay people fairly? I think it's interesting to realize that it then brings in diversity and inclusion issues into that question. I think people often consider it very much as two separate things of like, how do we support diversity? And also how do we think about paying people? But when you realize that those two things are connected, it changes how you approach it.
Okay.
Ellen, did you want to add anything here on kind of how you're thinking about or seeing companies deal with diversity in the remote side?
I think it is a lot harder in many ways for companies who are just moving into it without having made that actual decision and being able to plan for it. I think we're seeing a lot of companies where like the managers weren't great before and now they're really struggling, and now they want to add like these surveillance tools. Like, I want to see what the work is doing, how many hours are they working. Like, it's just not it's not just not good management, and people have to learn how to manage remote workers. I think, we're actually at Project Include, we're doing some research now with Caroline Cinders and on ways that harassment is now turning up, racial and sexual harassment is now turning up in these
interesting
places. And how do we think about it? How do we categorize all these different types? And how do we help companies both manage it for their internal employees, and then also these companies who are building the tools, like what features can they add to help prevent it or help with reporting on it? So there's a lot of change that's happening, and we have to be thoughtful and deliberate about it. As Nicole said, we can't just assume it's going to go great because we think being remote is wonderful, but it's not for everybody, and you need to do things differently to make it work.
Yeah. It's still work. Like, we still have to put effort into fixing the problems that exist, is what it sounds like. I'm curious, when we think about diversity and inclusion, I think for a long time some of the dialogue has been around, cool, how do we make things like equal access, like have people like in the pipeline, give opportunity. And luckily, I think now the dialogue has shifted to this idea of you're either racist or anti-racist. And so when you think about creating programs that are actively anti-racist in terms of diversity, I'm curious because I think a lot of companies actually run into some legal constraints on this front, that when you're thinking about hiring and you're trying to make decisions to increase the diversity of your workforce, you obviously cannot be biased against people of the races that you may feel like you have in extreme in your workforce. I'm curious, when you're working with a company, how you actually instill the diversity into the hiring process without kind of erring onto that side. And feel free, either of you, to start on that one.
I'm happy to. There are a bunch of ways to do it that do not run afoul of the law and actually uphold the spirit of trying to diversify, especially along race and gender lines, which is a lot of what we're talking about in terms of how people are looking at diversifying. But obviously, it's a lot of other things beyond that. I put an emphasis on racial and ethnic diversity first because it's the hardest for a lot of companies. And if you get that right, then other types of diversity, it just sort of gets easier to attract folks. And so there are two parts to your question that I want to answer. Number one, assuming that our company is anti-racist and that that's the stance we want to take for this next generation is good. I'm absolutely for it. And one of the things that happens, and that I've been telling clients for a really long time, is you can tell somebody that they don't get to be racist inside your company. And you can tell people that they have to actively be anti-racist inside your company. This does not run afoul of diversity. It's not like, well, some people are racist, some people are anti-racist, that's diversity. No. You get to draw a line on values. You get to draw a line on behaviors. You get to draw a line on how people treat each other, right? I don't get to know who you voted for, and I can't fire you if I find out and I don't like who you voted for. But when your ideology starts to come out on your coworkers, you won't collaborate with people, you talk over some people, then we've got a problem in your behaviors. So that's number one on the anti-racism side. And then on the hiring side, once you are really clear about your values and your value proposition for diversity, like what are we trying to get from diversifying? Not just generically like diversity is good, but like for your product, for the thing that you're trying to put out in the world, what does an increase in diversity get you that you couldn't have otherwise had? And so then when you're hiring, you start to understand that you're looking for lived experiences for which things like race and gender can be proxies, not precise proxies, but because so much of life in the United States right now is predictable along race lines, unfortunately still, big data wise, you go, we need people, let's just say you're going to open a store in downtown LA, right? And you say, we need a preponderance of people who are fluent in Spanish. and maybe Farsi, right? And you go, great. When you put that in your job description, you start to get a greater diversity of people who will apply. And when you say this is a skill you have to have because it has an impact on what we're able to sell in downtown LA, makes perfect sense. And so people get really hung up on, I need to hire that person because they're the underrepresented one. And that if that's how you're making decisions about diversifying, you're going to keep messing up. And yeah, you will run afoul of the law. But you have to back way up into what kind of company are we trying to build and what does diversity get us that we couldn't otherwise have, in order to make it clear where you're looking for talent and how you vet talent and what kinds of skills. So, you know, there's this whole like bar lowering thing. And of course, I don't subscribe to that point of view, but we hear it a lot, like, well, if you diversify, you're going to lower the bar. The answer is not about lowering the bar. The answer is about widening the definition of what good looks like in your company and what contribution looks like in your company. So forget raising or lowering, talk about widening and expanding, and then these things start to make sense. I can talk about the mechanics of how you make sure that, you know, your pipeline is diverse and you mitigate bias in the hiring and selection process, and your yield should look a certain way. There are a lot of ways to do that that are perfectly legal, and you should be doing them. So sorry, that was a little bit of a long answer, but I want to make sure I got both parts of your question.
It's great. I think something I've also learned from researching it a little bit is also that you legally can commit to hiring in a way that changes the diversity statistics in your industry, if that's like a specific goal that you have, and that it is legal to hire in order to achieve that, and to set out that as one of your kind of parameters when hiring, which I didn't know until doing a little bit more research a few months ago.
It's true, but just the one caveat on that is that when we use that as the blunt instrument for all of our diversity, what ends up happening is the same thing that happens with affirmative action in higher education, that people go, oh, I know how you got hired. Oh, I know why you're in school, right? I showed up at Stanford my first day, freshman year. Someone saw my last name and said, well, I know how you got in, but you know, some of these other people, these white people among us must be really, really smart. And and so when you don't manage that part well, and you use one aspect as sort of a blunt force instrument, then you start to set up people from underrepresented backgrounds for more exposure, vulnerability, and failure. And we don't do that, so
it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Ellen.
I want to add on. I thought Nicole did. I have nothing to add to what she described, but I do want to add to like the impact that you have once you start bringing on board, you know, a more diverse team, is that, you know, you do attract more diverse, you know, more diverse pools of people. And that is what, you know, one CEO called it has a flywheel effect. So when I was at Reddit, you know, we had a very diverse executive team, and people just came. Like, we didn't have to go out and recruit for people from backgrounds. They were interested in working at a company where, you know, we had one line of command where, you know, I'm a woman, the VP of engineering was a woman, the manager was a woman, and then the software engineer was a woman. So we had a line of 4 women going down, and I think 2 or 3 women of color going down the line of engineering, which is, you know, which the VP of engineering was like, I've never had that in her, you know, 20-year career. So it attracts people in a way that, you know, in a way that is, you know, it makes that initial investment, which might be harder. I need to change my process. I need to educate my team on eliminating bias. I need to make sure that I'm widening the skills that I'm looking at. Somebody who paid their way through college and worked 3 jobs obviously has more skills and experience than somebody who, you know, had their parents just pay for it, and they, you know, and they didn't do any jobs during college and during their summers or anything like that, right? There's, you know, value to the other work that's not directly related to the, you know, to the traditional things that we look for, but is directly related to the ability to work on a team and to get things done and to fulfill the requirements of the job. So trying to think about things more broadly, I think, is really important, but also thinking about like the long-term impact of what you're doing for your company. And then the last thing I'll say is, it's also, like, you know, this is a question of risk. And sometimes it might be okay to take some risk and say, you know, there was one CEO that we worked with where he was like, when I had 6 white men for the engineering team, I realized if I hired another white man for number 7, I was not going to get out of this bind, because it was just going to get harder and harder and harder to hire somebody out of it. And I said, I don't care, what background they're from, but they can't be another white man. And he was like, I don't care if, I'm taking some risk by saying that. And obviously if there was some tremendous white male candidate, maybe he would have made an exception, but it was like, I'm going to not have a successful company at the end of the day if I don't make this call right now.
Yeah. So the next topic that we had was related to kind of the other side of things, which was more on inclusion, which if we can go to the, perfect. So one of the things that I think is interesting with inclusion is that obviously we're getting a sudden insight into way more information about people than we knew before. Like I know what all of your homes look like now, just from this quick webinar. But it's really changed a lot of the dynamics when working from home. And so I'm curious some of the new challenges that you all are seeing. I think one we've seen just on our team is, Wi-Fi access, having kids at home. But when you're talking with companies, how are they thinking about it, or what are the trends that you all are seeing personally? Maybe starting with Ellen this time, why not?
I think it's hard. I think, there's such a disparity of, I was talking to somebody from Google, and they're like, you can see, like when you see one of the executives and they have this giant study and they have like shelves and they have a conference table within their study. And, it's very different than when you see somebody who doesn't have the space, they don't have a nice background, and some companies are giving their employees like screens. So you can put a screen behind you, nobody sees your
Oh, interesting.
Uncomfortable with what your home looks like, or if you're a very private person, it's kind of an equalizer and a shield. I think, people with kids, I have found in my conversations that people are very, people are very understanding, because it's happened, right? Like the cat comes into the screen, my dog will come, child wants a snack, right? So you get used to it. I'm sure there are places where it's not that friendly, and I don't know how you get people to change out of that if in this environment they're not willing to be more accommodating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And what I've started telling clients is that flexibility is an inclusion issue. That if you come up with a set of assumptions for everybody, that everybody's trying to juggle something, and that we don't get too prescriptive about like, if you have kids, then this, if you have adult, elder care, then that, but just assume that everybody's trying to juggle their life in a way.
Yeah.
My dogs are going to go nuts right now, and you can hear that in the background. There's nobody here to get them. So if you can really internalize that flexibility is a massive inclusion issue, and we're helping clients move more towards deadlines and deliverables, as opposed to every time we have to do something, we're going to all look at each other on a screen as if we're all co-located. And that's not good for anybody. And that's precious time. Like screen time should be seen as absolutely the most valuable time. My dogs, I'm so sorry. As the most valuable time, like do the math on how much this meeting is costing you and do fewer of those, because you just see the glaze. People's eyes are just like, I am not here. Like, I am not here. I have got kids. I've got dogs. They're crying. My neighbor is now chainsawing a tree, and you're just like, I can't do this right now. How can we make the culture inclusive such that you don't have to explain everything? You can say, hey, I need to cut this one short. And everyone goes, okay, that's an act of inclusion. And so in the meantime, while we're all like this, not making people have to justify how hard things are for them in order to get some grace and some flexibility, that is the big message for us right now around inclusion.
Yeah, that's something we've been embracing a lot, this idea of, we've been calling it windowed work, where like there's certain windows where you're available for collaboration real time and other windows where you are not. And that doesn't impact the ability for you to get work done. It's the point that kind of keeps resonating with me from what you all are saying is that many things are, or almost all things are an inclusion issue, that the way in which we approach them can help foster or help antagonize inclusion for the team. And that what I've seen from working internally at Medium and some other companies on inclusion work is that it often is a conversation of education, which I'm sure you both understand, given that that's what you do often with companies, is educate them on how this works. But I think from an internal perspective, sometimes it can feel very antagonistic of like, I'm trying to push diversity, inclusion, and equity work, and my leaders won't listen. I'm curious, as you're thinking about that kind of responsibility often landing on the individual to try to push that or try to drive that, when you work with companies, whose responsibility do you see it is to help adjust that? Or is it something that is kind of everyone's kind of role to be involved in?
You want to go first, Ellen? Okay, I'll go. I'll give it a shot. So, you know, the pithy answer is inclusion is everybody's job, and that's true. But that can only show up in, they don't, you know, individuals only have so much power in an organization. And so it also has to show up in policies and procedures and social norms and communication. And so the thing that I advocate for often is that you actually have a vertical that deals with this, right? That you would have something like a chief culture officer under whom DEI is part of the charge, and it's separate from HR, right? It is its own, it's how we do our work. There is an executive who says everything underneath this is the how, right? So I would do internal communications, maybe even facilities, because those are all of the places where inclusion shows up. It's easy for us to think about building a facility that needs to be able to accommodate people who use wheelchairs. That's an obvious inclusion issue. There are many less obvious inclusion issues that when you aren't running it through a lens of diversity and equity also, you'll miss. You'll just miss it every time. And I think now we think about things like all gender bathrooms as being like, of course we need to have that. But I've been at this long enough to know that people just thought I was just bonkers the first time I said it, is that you need to create a place that is safe for people of all genders to like use the facilities. And they're like, what are you talking about? There's so many concepts in that idea. And now, now we're moving towards it with a more like, oh, of course, that's what we need to do. And so the policies and some of the hard facilities and the way that we talk to each other, the way we resolve conflict has to be owned ultimately by an executive. It just has to, because teaching people as an outside consultant is one thing, and then continuing to remind people and hold folks accountable, make sure it shows up in things like performance reviews and comp conversations and promotions. And if you can't demonstrate that you know how to enact inclusion, you know how to behave in an inclusive way, at least in my organization, you're not going to be promoted. And the way that I describe inclusion as an individual act is, are your hands open or your hands closed? Are you like listening, or are you like already, because you're not going to know all the ways that all the people show up in the world. That's not possible. Yeah. But when you are met with something new, right? I need this in order to be included, or that hurt me. Is your response to be like, oh, that's exclusive? If your response is, I didn't know, tell me more, that's inclusion. And sometimes it comes down to just that very difference of like, quit whining to tell me more. And you can get so much further with your inclusive culture.
Ellen, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree. Like, it is everybody's responsibility. You need to have a leader at the top of the executive team who is responsible for the day-to-day and for all the details and for thinking about it 100% of the time. But at the end of the day, like, the person who's ultimately responsible for inclusion work is a CEO. And if the CEO is inclusive and cares, you will have an inclusive company. If the CEO has delegated because they don't care, you will not have an inclusive company, right? People look at how the CEO makes decisions. Oh, there's an engineer who's critical to shipping the product, who's done something really racist or sexist. It goes up to the CEO because it's got an impact on the ship date. And if the CEO says ship date's more important, that's going to, everybody's going to do that same bad behavior, because the star employee who is allowed to stay despite that behavior is the star employee and probably gets a lot of other benefits that other people want. And, that then reinforces his bad behavior. And it's because the CEO made the wrong decision. And that's not going to be the only wrong decision that the CEO makes. So really thinking about it as being leadership driven. That's why our program works with CEOs, is going to make a difference. And also the co-founders, because the co-founders in the early stages have a huge impact on the culture. So, that's what's going to drive the, thinking about everything at every stage, bringing on the right person to run it, who's not buried under some HR or legal organization, who's actually going to, be thoughtful and be advocating at the highest level and pushing things that maybe the CEO is not that comfortable with, or maybe the VP of engineering or the VP of sales, but really doing that kind of, this is an equal business priority and I'm going to advocate for it, even if I'm not going to make friends, because I know the CEO is going to support me, and I'm going to kind of push the things that are right for the whole organization, not for our lawyers, not for company risk, but for the long-term health of the culture and performance of the company.
Yeah, I definitely, the talking about it around the impact, and therefore being able then to think about how it's good for the business really makes it clear that like the CEO and the leadership team needs to be bought into that viewpoint, not just about it as a like societal good. It's been interesting from my perspective as a founder of an early stage startup to realize that you don't get to like check the diversity, inclusion, and equity box one day and you're like, cool, we did it. It is like a continual process, which on the one side can feel very frustrating, right? You're like, I just want to see progress. But on the other side, I think gives us so much more room to be humans in that and to actually make trade-offs throughout the process. Like I think it's hard, we're a 12-person company. It's hard for us to support certain things that a larger 50 or 100-person company can support and can make room for, like having a part-time person or things like that is less in our ability right now due to management overhead. But being able to do that later opens up the different backgrounds or different skills that we can have in certain roles. And it's interesting, I think, by thinking of it as a long-term process instead of we have to check all the boxes today, it actually opens up more opportunity for us. But it's a relief that our leadership team is very bought in. But to your point earlier, Nicole, the open hands, like our biggest win for inclusion was that recently we put out our first parental leave policy, and the team hated it. And they told me that. They were like, this isn't great. And I was like, okay, back to the drawing board. Like, we'll come back. And we made some changes. And that to me was like, cool. That shows to me that we built an inclusion culture on our team, is that the team felt comfortable saying, this isn't great, and that we were able to change that because of it. Not that we had the perfect policy to start. And that for me is kind of the intersection of growth mindset and some of the inclusion work as well. I want to make sure we get to our last topic and have time for questions, which I apologize, I forgot to remind folks earlier, but if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll be kind of answering as we move forward. But one of the kind of things we wanted to touch on towards the end was just there is such momentum right now, and there's such an opportunity, as you all put it. I was really interested to hear you all say that there's kind of trends, ups and downs, and this is a moment where people are excited and engaged. I think right when I moved to San Francisco around 6 years ago, there was also a moment where people were talking about it a lot more, and then it kind of faded, and I was like, what? And now it makes sense. It kind of comes and goes. But I'm curious, when you're working with teams internally, how do you help them think through around capitalizing on this momentum to some extent of like trying to push more initiatives right now? Or how do you think about that when working internally with companies? Let's start with Nicole.
Well, sometimes I feel like I'm the one capitalizing on the moment, and capitalizing on the moment means activating them. And so there's that. But there are some organizations, and I would say for me right now, I have tech, retail, film and media, and nonprofit are my four, but tech still over indexes. And it's kind of showing up differently in each. So the nonprofit sector, at least the organizations I'm working with, are like, it's our time to strike. Like, we got it. Like, this is happening because there's social, there are racial social justice organization already. And so they're like, great. And so they're trying to raise money in a certain way, and they're trying to do, and so that's really interesting. I would say the trickiest clients right now are the ones where the CEOs are just now pulling their head up and going, what is all of this? And you go, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it. You got to go faster. And so in the past, I haven't done so much work with like DEI committees because I don't think it's a sustainable structure. But because so many companies they're acting on that impulse right now, what we're trying to do is wrap services around that DEI committee and figure out how to turn it into something more permanent with actual like, staff and that sort of thing. But those DEI committees is where the momentum is building inside companies. So I've been doing a lot of things around doing like advanced trainings for those people, helping them build their charter and budgets and how to talk to leadership about capitalizing on this moment and moving it forward. So it's been really interesting to do this DEI committee thing because it tends to be a core group of predominantly people of color, predominantly late millennial, early Gen Z, but not exclusively, who are like, why is this so hard? Can we just like get this done? And so trying to work with them to bring them up to speed on like, because if you say it that way, you're not going to get what you want. Let me help you repackage it in a way that will land on your CEO's ears and your C-suite. And some of it is frustrating as usual, is like people of color doing a ton of work to try to get the attention of white folks. And that's frustrating. But what I am seeing is a response to them different than what I've seen in the past. And so for that, we've been wrapping our services around those volunteer DEI committees in a new way. And that's where a lot of my hope is in some of the companies we're engaging with right now, that they'll keep it moving.
Yeah, I'd see it the same way. I think one of the things that, we're trying to push is that it's not a zero-sum game. Like it's often treated, after Me Too, like in, I guess, 2018, a bunch of companies said, okay, intersectionality is our keyword for this year, and our company is going to focus on intersectionality. I don't think a lot of companies knew what that meant, right? So they knew it was important, but they didn't know what to do. And then the Me Too movement had its second wave, and they all then went back to gender, which was binary gender, mostly white women. And, and now we've got the Black Lives Matter movement kind of having another wave too. And, the key is like, how do we make sure that what we're doing now is lasting, that it's actually changing the structure? It's not, I'm going to throw some money or I'm going to do a training and I'm going to feel better. And hopefully I keep my employees happy and they stop, criticizing me. And it's, so, when we work with CEOs, we're really trying to get them to understand, like, why are people unhappy? Like, why are people so frustrated? What are the problems that are throughout the tech industry? We focus on tech startups. So it's the tech industry issue, it's true, but you're part of it. So, don't feel like you're a bad CEO, but you can be a better CEO, right? And how can you take control of this area where you feel completely ill-equipped, where there is no role model? Like we look around tech and there is not a single company that we can say is, this is what you should be doing. They follow them. There are some companies that are doing better than others, but then, you have a Pinterest where you thought they were doing really great and all of a sudden, there are actually a lot of problems, right? So it's a hard thing, there is no role model. You have to be a leader. And this is what you do as a CEO. You're a leader. And especially in tech, you're trying to be innovative. So try to innovate, take some risks, push yourself, and really try to understand why these problems are here and what you can do. You need to change how you interview. You need to change that whole process. Like Nicole was like, oh, there's so much you can do. And I don't want to get into either, because that is a whole nother 2-hour webinar. To think about like everything, and that's just recruiting, right? To think about how do you do promotions? How do you do pay? I think, tech people see as leaders, but we've tried to reinvent things without actually looking at what hasn't worked in other industries and not repeating those mistakes, which we are currently doing. And hopefully this moment in time makes us realize like we are part of the problem and we need to think about how do we change things and really rethink things. And, and there are some tech companies that are doing really interesting things around. I think Range is a really interesting company. Earlier, we talked about like ways to include people. And I think, your roulette wheel idea where it's people pick who's going to talk next based on roulette wheel until you get to every single person in the group. You can make these, these video meetings more inclusive, and this is a good time for it. But you can also make it worse by allowing, harassment online. So like tech can be a plus, tech can be a minus. So, we're trying to push to make sure that people are thinking about all of the ripple effects of what they're doing, and really trying to get to that initial cause to make it better. Go back to your values. What are you trying to do? And is that good? Think about ethics. Are you doing the right thing? Are you doing no harm? Right? Like, let's start from a very basic perspective and then move out, and let's stop focusing on growth, regardless of the costs.
Totally.
There's one piece of that made me think of, there's a group I don't want to let off the hook in this, and I'm not including Ellen in this, but investors are often, especially like sort of like larger institutional investors, usually not your angels necessarily, or your friends and family, if you have friends and family around. But one of the difficult things I have seen is an eager CEO who is younger, saying, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. And if there is a perception from the institutional investor that this is weird, we've never seen this before, this can't be right, and there's this clear generational split, it can stop, all your DEI efforts can stop dead in their tracks. And I've unfortunately been in that situation a handful of times where the company is doing great and the momentum is building and the people are happy and our retention rates are higher, and we're able to recruit and attract talent from lots of different backgrounds. And you hit that investor class and they go, no, you're going to do it like we said, because you're a unicorn, or you can be a unicorn, and we're going to extract our billions, and you're going to just do what we say. And the first time I saw it, I was like, wait, that's like a sinister cartoon. That was it's like twirling mustache kind of stuff. Like, ha ha ha, we're going to stop you dead in your tracks. And then the second time I was like, oh, and then the third time it's a pattern, and you go, oh. So there is a group of CEOs that wants to get this right and have another albatross around them that they didn't see as being at odds with this, and it is where their money is coming from. And that is a tension that is going to have to break open and be resolved in this next generation of tech. Otherwise, we don't have business leading systemic change at all.
Yeah. And we've seen it at even the level of there's, that's great if you work on that. But then there's no support or no questions asked about that. And that's kind of the subliminal message of like, well, I don't really care that you're doing that. I don't care if your team is diverse because I'm not asking you about it. I'm asking you about your business metrics. And I don't consider that a business metric. And even when we've gone to some of our investors who we really enjoy working with, sometimes their response is like, wait, you want support to do what? And we're like, well, you have access to multiple teams. You could probably help a lot of us go ahead and do whatever this training is, but we can't afford it on our own. And their reaction sometimes is like, we'll think about it. And so I think there is a huge role for investors to play in that. If kind of through the lens of they're also like our exec team to some extent, they're an extended part of that. I want to make sure we leave a few time for a few questions. Michael, I know you've been collecting a few. Is there anyone that you want to share with us that we can spend a few minutes on?
Yes, lots of really good questions that have come through. I'll start with our first question that came through from Tenzin, who asked, what do you think about the companies committing to diversifying their boards? Do you see companies making structural changes to change the internal culture of their companies? Who should we? Oh, I see that Nicole unmuted, so let's start with you.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Ellen. Go ahead. I think Ellen.
I'm working on a piece about diversifying boards to publish, and it's really hard because the way we do it today, it's like the investor puts money in and demands a board seat. It's important to the investor to be on the board because it gives them credit for a win if the company does well, and they're assuming the company will do well. And usually that goes to the most senior investor, who is, I think 90% of investors, especially of the older generation, are white men. So you end up with like an older white man on your board. They don't want to leave. And then every time you raise money, it might not be when you actually need a new board member, but they demand a board seat and you end up with another board seat. Your independent seats go to people who are their friends, unless you're really active. But but startups actually have a lot of leverage. They just don't realize it. Like I never understood why they let firms put the person they want onto the board. Like you're going to be with this person for 10, maybe 15 years. Why would you let, somebody else dictate that just because you're getting their money? You haven't taken their money yet. They want you to take their money. You get down to a certain point and you can ask for it. There was another CEO who had a board member. They had like 4 white men on their board, and the board member said, "You really need to diversify your board." And I said to him, "You should tell him that you need to step off, right? Like, how am I going to diversify my board if you're staying on it? Like, if I get rid of you and I put somebody else on, that's 25%, change in the makeup of my board. But you can't have your cake and eat it too and tell me I need to diversify without being, you're part of the problem. So you need to, you need to step up and take responsibility and hold yourself accountable too."
Yeah, and the other thing I think is that I totally agree with Ellen. I'm trying to find places where we can disagree and make this, but I'm like,
I keep trying to.
Ellen and I are like, yeah, because we talk about this stuff too. But the other thing is that it's really important to understand that at that level, those are the people who least understand DEI, right? And so they will make all of those rookie mistakes like, I have a Black friend, let me put them on here, right? Not thinking about how diversifying a board should change your company. Should change the questions that are being asked. There's nothing magical about bringing a person of color on that does something for your company. So you've got one and you go, great, it's that person versus everybody else, or that person just stays quiet because it's not worth arguing with the rest. So the way that they're looking at diversification is like, let's get ourselves a woman. My sister does great work in her, whatever, let's put her on. Great, we've got a woman. And those are those rookie mistakes that we don't tolerate anymore at lower levels of the organization, but the system supports it at the highest levels of the organization. And let's be honest, where all the money is, right? So when we talk about equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's hilarious in tech that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, somehow equity stops meaning money. When I'm like, it's literally the word we use in tech for like, how much of a thing do you own? But then we take it away when we wedge it between diversity and inclusion. And so these are the least skilled people at DEI making some of the most impactful decisions about your representation. And there isn't a mechanism to disrupt that yet. So there are ways around it, but there hasn't been at scale a mechanism to disrupt that assumption.
And I want to echo, these really are the least skilled people at, if you look at the firms, they are not inclusive at all. If they have somebody of color, it's probably somebody super junior. You look at their, it's very hierarchical, and the management team is usually like 4 or 5 white men, and they're usually over 50, or maybe they're in their 40s if you're like certain firms will kick out the older people, which is even less inclusive. And, we at Project Include, one of our recommendations is like, don't get advice from your investor if they haven't figured out how to make their own teams inclusive. And I had a VC come to me and just ream me out saying, if we weren't allowed to talk about things that we haven't done, we wouldn't be able to give any advice, right? Organization, no. I'm like, but this is one area where you really can't. Yeah. Like,
I had one investor tell me in a company, do you know you're ushering in a reign of terror? And I was like, what? And he said, this is a reign of terror for white men in tech. And I was like, gosh,
wow,
I didn't know I had all that power, but it was so foreign to him, the work that I was doing. And he just came out of, he came out of nowhere. And it was just like, whoo, right in your face. Like, how dare you? But the good news in that regard is we're getting it somewhere. Like I said, I've been doing this for almost 27 years. Nobody was listening. The first engineering team I put together was majority Native American. I learned so much from that. But everyone was like, that's weird. Why would you care about that? Fast forward 27 years, and now we're like finally meeting the resistance. And that is progress, as annoying and painful as it may be. It's progress.
Yeah. Let me just check our time. I think we might have time for one more question, Michael, if you want to select one.
Sure, and there are a lot here. So I will also try to, there will be a follow-up blog post where we share the recording and the slides will also be shared. So I'll try to get those questions possibly answered by each of you in that blog post as well. Let's go with a question from Janine. How do you foster psychological safety for minorities on your teams? How do you get people who don't belong to a minority group to support them?
Mm-hmm.
I'll take this one first. So this is one where it's really, really, really important from the founding of your company that you demonstrate what psychological safety means. And psychological safety is for everybody. Everybody. It's one of those things around inclusion where y'all means y'all. It's like everybody needs to experience psychological safety. Different groups of people can access what that feels like and what that doesn't feel like faster than the others because of lived experience. Right. And so the way we foster it on my team and the way that I recommend that it is fostered with our clients is, first and foremost, you have to know what your posture is supposed to be with each other, according to your organization. So in one organization I work with, the assumption is we trust you from day one. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when we say we trust you and we're going to work on continuing to trust you, you can lose trust, but you don't have to go gangbusters to earn it. We hired you, you have it. There's something in that shift that helps people, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, release from them the notion that they have to keep proving and reproving each other if you truly mean it, right? Proving and reproving themselves and their skills, which is a big drag on the system for people from underrepresented backgrounds. The second thing is you have to have a standard way that you resolve conflict. You have to have a standard way across backgrounds where you say, we're having an issue. This is how we at our company resolve it, not leave you up to your own devices to go and figure it out, because then power dynamics come into play. People are using different language and talking past each other. It's very threatening, especially for people from underrepresented backgrounds when they're in a conflict with somebody with more power or authority, either conferred or just implied. And so making sure that you understand how to resolve conflict in a uniform way in your company is another really important aspect of psychological safety. There are 15 others, but those are two of my favorites.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, I was going to say, the conflict one really stands out to me. That's, I think a lot of people think of conflict as bad, and I think it's really wonderful when you get into conflict, but you're totally right that having that framework that someone can fall back on. The thing that I was going to add is that one of the big practices that I incorporate as a leader is to be vulnerable. So one of the key things that research shows is that to increase trust, you have to be vulnerable. Otherwise, it's really hard to get to know someone. And so, for instance, an example of this is I've always been really open at Range about going to therapy. It's something that we also sponsor as one of our benefits. But it makes me so happy that when I pull up our team calendar now, everyone's got therapy on their calendar and it's a public event. I can see it. People are sorry, I can't reschedule. I don't want to pay the fee for therapy. It really changes that. And it makes talking about your emotions feel more real. And I think there are obviously levels to the extent that you feel comfortable with different people, but that's a thing that any individual can start to do, is try to be a little bit more vulnerable. And I say start with 10% more than you currently feel comfortable. You don't have to go, gangbusters, but try that. What about you, Ellen?
I agree with both of you. I think one thing that companies can do is to create a set of values so everybody's working from the same set of assumptions, and then create a set of boundaries with a code of conduct, this is allowed, this is not allowed. I feel safe, I know that this non-inclusive language is not permitted, and I know what to do if somebody uses it. I have the process to deal with the conflict, and I know that, and I feel safe because I have a few different ways of dealing with it, and I can pick the one that I'm most comfortable with. And and I have to trust the process. I have to trust that people are actually going to do the right thing and uphold this code of conduct and maintain the norms that we're establishing. I want to go back to something that Nicole said early on, where you have to feel comfortable, and people should be able to say things and feel psychological safety, except if it's around exclusion. I may be happy in the existing structure because it protects my, it gives me all these privileges and it gives me entitlement. And when those are taken away so that everybody has the same level of entitlement and privileges, I feel threatened. but that's not a threat that the company should be protecting, right? So, Nicole nodding her head violently, like, yeah, because it's different, right? So there are areas where you should feel safe and areas where it might feel uncomfortable, but eventually you'll realize when everybody has these same protections, everybody's working from the same page, the same assumptions, the same expectations, it actually makes things a lot easier.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you both so much for joining us. I learned a lot during this call, so I hope that everyone else who joined in as well. We've got some resources that we have here that we'll also share in our deck, but also wanted to share you all's contact information if anyone wanted to kind of follow up or reach out to work with either of these organizations. Obviously, Range is a big fan, and just really seeing the impact that they can have. And yeah, thank you both for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for people doing a video in the middle of the day. I appreciate it.
Yeah, same. And feel free to reach out to our team. I'm just Jen, Jen at range.co. If you want to follow up or chat more about kind of your team specifically, we're happy to chat. Cool. Thank you all.